couple of days ago, or maybe more than that, I'm not sure. But, watched a video with Leighton Flowers, where he responded to a video that Chris Day had done, and I'm not going to read the whole video. There were several things in there. There were a few analogies that he was responding to, but one of them that really stuck out to me was this analogy involving a novelist and the world that he creates, and and the reason this stuff was because I've in the past I've explored this. I've back probably 10 maybe more years ago. I was actively trying to sell some of my novels, and part of what I was doing was I was writing blog posts on a regular basis, and one of the posts that I wrote involved me interviewing one of my characters. So I actually entered into the world of the novel and actually talked to one of the characters. And I, back at that time, I was giving a lot of thought to some of this stuff, and I had thought about this analogy, how an author can be kind of thought of similar to the way that God is thought of in relation to our world. God created our world. Well, the author created the world of their story, whatever that is, and so you have that natural sense of, okay, the characters are living out their lives, and I had kind of thought about this and thinking, well, okay, is that a way that we can explain some of what God does? Maybe he's made some decisions, and he's like this author, authoring this world, and I had given that some thought, and now I'm looking back at it and thinking I'm not even sure what side I came down on at the time, but I had given that some thought, and so I kind of latched onto this. I kind of looked at this, but as far as who these guys are, if you haven't heard of them, well, Leighton Flowers is he's kind of the anti-Calvinist guy, which would actually he's not really anti-Calvinist, but he does talk a lot against Calvinism, and he describes himself as a provisionist, and basically the idea there is God has provided a way for everyone to receive salvation, but not everyone does, and so everyone has a choice, and they actually have an actual choice. They have the freedom to choose to accept what God has provided or not. And then we have Chris Date. He's a Calvinist, and his view is more of Calvinism is the view that God has selected certain people before he created the world. He selected certain people to be saved, and Chris's view is I believe he would be what you would call a compatibilist, and that's probably why he's trying to tie in this analogy. He's trying to explain how God could both determine everything that happens. He's determined all that has happened, and yet we have choices. We have this sense that we have a choice in our salvation, in the choices we make every day, and all of that. And so he's trying to find a way to explain that. So we have this analogy, and his view is, okay, you have an author. The author has written this, but within that story, you don't have any of the characters. They're still within that story. They're making that choice, and I've queued up some of this to let you listen to what Chris said and some of Leighton's response, and that way you'll have a better understanding of what's being said instead of just listen to me explain what they're saying.
Take, for example, the relationship between J.R.R. Tolkien and Middle-earth, the story captured, or the world features in the Lord of the Rings series and The Hobbit, the Silmarillion, etc. We Calvinists, as theistic determinists, not naturalistic or materialistic ones, can say that the relationship between God and human beings is somewhat akin to the relationship between Tolkien and the characters in Middle-earth. When Sam and Frodo, after their very long journey, are standing at the edge of Mount Doom, and Sam urges Frodo to cast the ring into the fire and thereby destroy it and save Middle-earth, Frodo decides not to. Frodo gives in to the temptation to wield the power that the One Ring has to offer. And thankfully, Gollum suddenly appears and snatches fights the ring away from Frodo, but then falls into the lava and is destroyed along with the ring. So thankfully, Middle-earth did actually get saved, but Frodo is the one who ultimately saved it in the end because he decided to hold on to the ring instead of casting it into the fire. Now here's the question that you need to ask yourself. At the moment in the world of Middle-earth, when Frodo is faced with the decision to either throw the ring into the fire in Mount Doom and destroy it, or hold on to it in order to wield its power, there is nothing forcing his hand. There aren't any strings attached to his limbs, like strings attached to the limbs of a puppet. There's not a long chain of dominoes falling that eventually causes his neurons to fire in some way that he merely experiences as a choice, or at least that needn't be the case. There's no hardware that is firing according to the software that it was programmed. Nothing that the puppet or robot analogies imply about human beings as actions are there in the case of Frodo and his decision either.
Yeah, you do have the determining factor. Let's look at it again with me. The author, the one right on the bottom, the author, by means of writing the story, determines all the characters' thoughts, actions, decisions. In other words, Frodo is obviously just a figment of Tolkien's imagination. It doesn't really exist. At least a clay pot can really exist. I mean, in other words, all analogies have their points of distinction. And Chris would, I think, agree with that. And it seems like to me you're offering another analogy without demonstrating, Chris, how our analogy is not a one-to-one ratio equal to the Potter puppeteer programmer analogies. You haven't offered any significant way in which.
When I first listened to this, I was agreeing completely with Leighton on this, and really I still am. So don't think that I'm changing my mind on this so much, but the more I thought about this, I think Leighton and Chris are talking past each other. So even though I think Leighton's right on what he's saying, I think he's missing what Chris is saying, and he's not really addressing what Chris is talking about. Now, as far as what we've heard so far, I think we listen to that and say, well, yeah, Leighton's right on that. And so I definitely don't want to disagree with what Leighton's saying here. He's talking about the author determining through writing what the characters are doing, and that's determinism. And yet Chris, he's really disagreeing with that. And we'll get there. I need to move forward just a little bit to let you hear some more of what Chris is talking about, and I don't think this next clip will quite get us there, but we do need to hear what he's saying.
Really the entire argument, as far as I can
throw the ring in or to hold on to it. And yet, Tolkien wrote the story the way that he did. Frodo's actions, his choice to hold on to that ring in order to wield its power instead of throw it into the fires of Mount Doom, was foreordained, predetermined by Tolkien, who created the world in his mind. Nothing at the moment that Frodo makes that decision, forcing him to make the decision he does.
Now, what do you mean by forcing? Okay, when you're talking about forcing.
So as far as what Chris is saying here, it sounds like he's going back to what Leighton's saying. He's saying, well, there is this author, and he's determining all this, and then he's coming in and he's saying, well, but no, it's not really that case. It's something else. It's this character is doing something that on his own is kind of the way it sounds, and of course I was left kind of scratching my head on that one. How is that the case? And I think that's probably where Leighton's coming from. How do we get there? But they're talking past each other here, and somehow Chris is bringing this in. He's thinking about this differently. I'm trying to figure out, okay, how's he thinking about that? And I think we move forward just a little bit more. We'll start to see what Chris is saying that's different than what Leighton is saying, and why Chris is saying what he's saying, or at least trying to say what he's saying,
but it's not forced from without. There's no external constraint forcing his hand this way or that. Keep in mind here is that when I offer this analogy, I'm not talking about the scene as it plays out while Tolkien is imagining it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the world that exists because the world of Middle-earth, and then a story that takes place in it, because Tolkien conceived of it.
Okay, so he's trying to.
So here, this is something that I think is really interesting. For me as an author, I think it's odd that Chris is talking about, okay, it's not the scene that played out in his mind, but it's the actual world that exists there. For me as an author, there's no difference. If I'm writing a story, that plays out in my mind, I know it's in my mind. I think up all this stuff, and yeah, I think of this world being there, but I never actually come up with this and say, well, there's something different than what's in my mind. It's just a story. It takes work. It takes time. It takes me going through and thinking about these things and how's this going to happen. I come up with something in my mind. I come up with something else and tear something else up and write this out and all that. It's all going on in my mind. I put it down on paper, and eventually I hope someone else reads it. In which case, it's going on in their mind, and there's not a real world out there. It's a story. But he's talking about this world that these characters are in as if it's an actual world. And so he's looking at this different, I think, than what at least different than what I would look at it as an author. I don't see it that way. But that's the way he's talking about it. He wants that analogy to be where there's an actual world, where this character is existing and doing all this stuff, and in that world, okay, the author does not exist. And then jump forward just a little bit more. I think it may kind of help to understand this a little bit better. And then I'll try to go back and show you what I think is what Chris is doing and how that's different than what Leighton is thinking.
Again, it assumes determinism.
right? Whether or not he's thinking about it actively, that particular scene at any particular moment, the reality is that in that world, Frodo made the decision he did and was preordained to do so by Tolkien, and yet there was nothing in that moment forcing Frodo's hand. So by
Okay,
So now I want to go and pull in an image that I put together that I think will help to explain some of this. If we think of what the world is like, if we go down to Middle Earth here, you have the characters that exist there, and within each layer, Middle Earth has no knowledge that they don't exist. If you look at the story of Middle Earth, all the characters that exist within that area, they have no knowledge that there's an author out there writing their story. They have no knowledge that there's a reader of that story. Now we have stories. One of my favorite stories was the Never-Ending Story, and in that story, the characters start to realize, they come to realize that there is someone out there. There's someone outside their story. Of course, that's a story in itself of characters that understand that there's a story going on. But we have various stories where that kind of thing happens. But in Middle Earth, you don't have that. You just have them existing there. Even though everything that they do is determined by an author, they have no knowledge of the author. It would be inconsistent with that story to bring in an author. It just would not be part of it. And then, of course, the manuscript itself exists within creation. The author, the reader, they are part of creation, but it includes others as well. Creation is where Leighton Flowers and Chris Day exist. And then you have something beyond that. Whatever was there before creation, that's whatever that is. And we don't know. I mean, for all we know, there could be multiple creations. We just don't know. I mean, beyond that is God. God knows what's there. God was there first. All that. So that's the layers of the world there. God's outside it all, and He knows what's in creation. And the analogy is like Middle Earth, creation has an author, and so God is the author of creation, like the author who wrote a manuscript is the author of Middle Earth. And so that's the basic idea there. And part of what I was looking at, that my initial thought was, okay, Chris Date he's talking about Middle Earth, but then he's jumping back to say, well, okay, yeah, there is an author. And so I was looking at this and thinking, okay, Leighton Flowers is there saying, okay, there's an author who's determining what happens within the story, and so it's determined. That's just determinism. The analogy shows determinism. The characters, they don't actually control their actions. They're not really responsible for their actions. Someone else determines this. And so it seems strange when Chris Day was saying, well, there's an author and then there's these characters. And so my thinking was, okay, he's trying to bring in Middle Earth as like creation, but then he's jumping back and saying, okay, there's an author. But I think what you actually have with Chris Day here is he wants to bring in Middle Earth and say, okay, they don't know about the author. Within that story, we have to stay within that story. For his analogy, what he's trying to get to is we have to stay within the story. We can't bring in an author because there's no author in that story. There's no one like that. Um, and and so within that story, it's true in that story that they are making decisions. And so he's saying, well, we're the same way. We are living out our story, and so he's basically saying, well, okay, God is the author of our story. He's determined what we're going to do, but within the story that God has written, we experience it as if there is no God, and yet we can't really say that either. And I'll get in that, but he's basically saying, okay, we don't know what God has determined for us, just like the characters in Middle Earth don't know what the author has determined for them, and they don't even know there's an author. Whereas within creation, we exist in creation. We're living out a story, and God has written that story. And so I think that's where Leighton and Chris are talking past each other, because Leighton's coming along. He's saying, well, there's an author, and the author's like God. There's a story, and there's a world in the book, and that's like creation. And so we're living out our lives, and so we're just determined. And if we're going to say we can blame anyway, well, yeah, we could blame God because he decided all this. And Chris is saying, well, no, because we don't know that. It's kind of where he's going. And if you look at a story, the characters in the story, they don't know that the author has determined this. And of course, if you're looking at a story in the novel, the author is not part of it, and if the author is there, the author is there because the author put himself there. He wrote and really just another character. When I wrote a story involving myself in interviewing my characters, it wasn't really me that was there in the story. When I wrote it, it kind of felt that way. It was kind of a fun exercise to put yourself in the story and kind of tell the story where you're there. But I wasn't really there. In my mind I was, but yeah, it wasn't truly me being there in the story. So, I think that's where Chris is trying to get. He's trying to say, well, in the story itself, these characters don't know that. They are actually, as long as we stay within the story, they're actually making those choices. And I agree with that. Frodo is making the choice. Within the story, Frodo's making the choice. Even though the author wrote this, within the story, it would ruin the story if we said, no, Frodo's not making the choice. It wouldn't be the same story if Frodo knew that there was an author. And so I kind of agree with Chris on that, but I don't know that we want to get there. And the problem is, it's not an author. It's not an author of a novel. Now, we could say, well, this is the way the world works. Maybe God did author a story and we're just living out the story, and we don't know what's going to happen. God wrote the story, but we're living it out, and to us it feels like we're making our choices, and because we're in the story, it feels like we're making true choices, but we're really just living out the story that God wrote. What does that mean? First of all, if we have this thing, well, who actually wrote the story? Now we say, well, God wrote the story. Well, okay, if we're part of the story and that's all we know is the story, then which God? And I say, well, which God? Not saying, okay, some other religion's God, but we have a God who's part of the story. And so God is there, and we're saying, well, there's a God who wrote our story, but that's all part of the story. We don't know what's outside the story. So the God who wrote the story is part of the story. We're talking about this God who's part of the story. He's a character in the story. And so we're looking at that and saying, okay, there's a God. He's in our story. There's a God who's bigger than everything. He's the greatest possible being. That God exists within the story, and if all we know about is the story, well, there's a God in the story who's a character in the story. Within the story, he's the greatest possible being. But in reality, he's not. And the reason I say that is because someone wrote him. Someone wrote the story. Someone wrote God's story. So we exist within the story. That's all we know. But there's something else. Of course, we're talking about this, so that's part of the story too. And so we have God, who's the greatest possible being within the story, but there's another God who's outside the story who created the story. And we don't know what that God is. We don't know if that God is any comparison to the God in our story or not. We just know there's a God who wrote the story, who included a God who wrote our story. And it gets us in a place where it doesn't make a lot of sense. Really it gets us to an infinite regress, because we talk about the God who's outside of our story, but that's part of our story too. So there has to be a God outside that story, and a God outside that story, and a God outside that story. And so it never gets us anywhere. So I don't think we want to go there. We don't want to say, well, there's a story that we're part of, and we're just living out the story. It doesn't work that way. We really want to get back to, okay, who is God? Where is God? And if God is there, it can't be that we just know our story. We have to know something more than that. So we can't say, well, the characters in the story don't know the author. We have to know the author, or it won't work. And so we have to look at these stories, not the one where Frodo is there making real choices, but we have to look at these stories where the characters know there's an author. And so that takes me back to the story I wrote for a blog, where I interviewed a character. The character knew that I was the author. And if the character knows I'm an author, now I'm writing the story. Now my problem there was, I could have the character ask me to do something, to change something about him, but it was still me writing that story. The character never really made any choices. It was all me making the choice. I was within the story. That's definitely determinism. If the character knows the author, that's determinism. He can blame the author for whatever happens. Now, of course, the author is determining what the character will blame him for, so it's not like the character is going to blame him for. And yet here we're saying we can blame God for something, because if it's determined we could blame God for something, for us to do that, that has to be something that God determined for us to do. So if we're going to blame God for the way he wrote our story, then it has to be that God has determined that we will blame him. Now, why would he do that? It's, I guess, possible, but it seems silly. It just doesn't make sense. And so I think I think the analogy still gets back to where Leighton is, even though Chris is looking at it a different way, and they're talking past each other. I think we still have to get back to where Leighton is, where yeah, the author is there, and we can't just say that the characters don't know. We can't say that they exist and they're making true choices. No, because to do that, we have to have a God outside of the story and all that. Whereas what Leighton's talking about is, okay, there's an author, and we know there's an author. Whether or not the characters know there's an author or not, we know that. So what we're talking about is a case where we know there's an author, and now we're talking about, okay, who's responsible for the actions of the characters? Sure, within their story, they're saying, well, you know, they're responsible, but that situation doesn't exist in what we're talking about, because we know there's an author, and it would be more, and to be analogous to our situation, we'd have to say the characters know that there's an author, and once the characters know there's an author, if the characters are going to make decisions, or real decisions, then it has to be a case where the author is not making those decisions for the characters. The author is letting the characters decide. Now, as an author, I'll say, well, sometimes it feels like the characters are making decisions, because there's certain things characters do that it's just the way they are. They're the person you're thinking of, you know, there's certain things they do, and it's like you kind of feel like they're making decisions, and yet you're deciding what they are doing as you're writing their story, based on what you know about the character. So it kind of feels like they're making the decision, but they're not actually making the decision. It's all playing out in your mind as they're making that decision. You know, you're making the decision for them. You know, for us, we're saying, well, you know, it doesn't feel like we're just a character with someone else making our decision. You know, I think if for us to make sense of this, it has to be the case where God is allowing us to make decisions. He doesn't have to allow us to make decisions, but I think it's a case where he has decided, well, that's the way it's going to work, and so we're living out our lives. We're making real decisions, which would be much more similar to a character knowing that there's an author, and the character being able to accuse the author, being able to accuse the author of doing something to them. And so then the character would no longer be responsible for their decision, even within the world they exist in. They would not be responsible, and they were not responsible. And so I think from that standpoint, you have to get back to where Leighton is on the subject, but at the same time, I think Chris he's trying to go a different way on this, but I don't see how it works. It just, I don't think it works. So I'm still agreeing with Leighton on this, but I think Chris was trying to go a different way, and I don't think Leighton really addressed Chris's view on it exactly, but I think the view that Leighton has is the correct view.